Hello, AP Psychology students. I have to say this is a lot less fun doing this in front of a camera than it would be if I was doing it in front of you all. I do miss you guys, but we're just gonna have to make the best of our circumstances. This, of course, is the video and the notes that go along with the attribution, actions, and attitude and actions quiz. So obviously, if you're hearing this, you've clicked on the video. Within the quiz, right underneath the video, is a PDF file uploaded of these notes. You can do one of two things. My recommendation is to click on the preview button, and that'll open up the notes that you can see while you're hearing this video and take the quiz at the same time. You can also download them and print them off, and you can do it that way too, but that would probably be a little bit easier. The quiz does go along with the video and the notes in order, so as I'm talking and as you're reading through, you should be able to answer the questions on the quiz and hopefully get them all right. So this is our last unit, unit number 9, social psychology. Most of it, of course, we're going to be doing online here, but again, we're going to make the best of this. So social psychology is understanding how we interrelate with others, how we influence other people, how they influence us. Specifically, you see the formal definition there, the study of how our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the real or imagined presence of others. Now, the real or imagined thing is important. Sometimes we know what people think about us. Most often, we think we know what other people think about us. In other words, we have this idea of what people must think about us, and sometimes we respond accordingly. So it doesn't have to be real. In fact, I'd say more often than not, we probably presume a lot of things about other people and their attitudes and their behavior and their thoughts and actions and everything else. Either way, it doesn't really matter. As they say, perception might as well be reality because it influences us either way. So that's kind of what the whole unit is. This specific one is attribution theory, attitudes, and actions. So first of all, attribution theory. What is attribution? Attribution is basically an explanation of why someone did what they did, an explanation of their behavior. And this is a very natural, innate desire for us to know this. Think about every time you hear of a school shooting, or when you hear, when you think about serial killers. What are the things we want to know more than anything else? Why? Why did they do this? What drove them to do this? Everyone asks the question. Everyone's talking about it, right? It's a very natural thing for us to want to know why people behave a certain way. Now, when we, not predict, but when we try to explain behavior, we usually go down one of two avenues. The first one is to explain behavior based on internal factors, usually personality. That's who they are. Okay, that's their personality. That's what that right. The other way is what's called an external factor, which is the situation or the circumstance that drove that. It's not who they are. There was something that drove them to do something outside of their natural self, and that's an external factor. Now, as we evaluate the actions of others, one of the most common errors that we make is what's called the fundamental attribution error, and that is when we look at other people, we tend to think that they did what they did because that's who they are, because that's the internal explanation, their personality, as opposed to weighing the circumstances or the factors or the situations that might have put them in that position. So an easy example, you're driving down the road and somebody swerves right in front of you and cuts you off. And of course, in your mind, what a jerk. Either that guy's an absolute idiot, they're mean, or they're a bad driver, right? And what are we doing? We're making the fundamental attribution error. We're assuming that the action is a result of who they are. What we might not know is the situation. Think about, they could be rushing somebody to the hospital, or they could be late for something very important. And if it were us, we would probably go the other route, which is what's called the actor-observer bias, which is the second error we tend to make. And that is, yes, we attribute others' actions to their personality, but when it comes to us, we always have an excuse. There's always a reason why we did what we did. It's not who we are, okay? It could be I cheated on the test. And normally you'd say, but I'm an honest person, all right? But I was in I had a situation where I didn't get a chance to study as much as I wanted to because of some external factor. Somebody in my family was sick, or I've been dealing with a lot of things, or I had a coach who made us practice late, or this or that, or something. We want to ascribe something to the situation, but that's not who we are. Okay, and so that's what's called the actor-observer bias, and that tells us more about how we interpret our own behaviors. This self-serving bias says, kind of along those lines, but this goes kind of a step further and says, okay, when we have success, we love to say that success is because of the internal factors of our personality. You get an A on a test, again, it's, well, that's because I studied hard, and I'm smart, and I get it, and all these things, right? When you get the F on the test, again, it's because of all these various excuses, these external factors that explain the failure. That's not who you are, but you happen to fail nonetheless. Sometimes we suffer from another error called unrealistic optimism, and that's the belief that favorable events are more likely to happen to you than to other people. And so think of the people, especially like those times when the lottery starts getting really high and everyone's buying a ticket. It's amazing to hear people talk about how convinced they are they're going to win. And they're already talking about plans of what they're going to do with the money, this and that. One of my favorites, if you remember from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, the grandparents are discussing Charlie's chances of winning, getting the golden ticket, and I think it's Grandpa Joe that says Charlie has a better chance than everybody else because he wants it more. Obviously, statistically, he doesn't have a better chance, given the fact that he only bought a couple chocolate bars and people are buying thousands. He had actually a lesser chance, but Grandpa Joe was convinced it's going to happen to him. Okay, so that's unrealistic optimism. And then self-handicapping. I hear a lot of students do this. Before you even attempt to do something, you've already offered an explanation for why you failed at it. I can't tell you how often on test day you guys come in here and, I'm going to fail this test. I don't understand any of it. Okay, now what are you doing? In a sense, you're setting yourself up for the failure so that if you do fail, it's kind of like, well, I knew it was going to happen. I'm not just, now if you succeed, it's like, oh, lucky me, right? But you're already kind of setting yourself up, or you might be nervous about a game, the game you have this afternoon or this evening is, oh, I don't know if I'm gonna, my knee's been hurting me. I don't know if I'm gonna be at my best. And so if you do fail, it's kind of like, well, that was expected, right? I wasn't expected to do good because I've already set myself up for why I should have failed. And so sometimes we self-handicap ourselves in that way as well. All right, so that's all attribution stuff, trying to understand people's behaviors. Next is the role of our attitudes, how attitudes are formed, changing attitudes, and then what effect that has on our actions, okay? So attitudes, we know what attitudes are, but the formal definition, beliefs, feelings, and behaviors that you have towards situations, events, or objects, okay? Generally, attitudes predispose us to act in a particular way. Based on what you think or your attitude about something tends to move you in one particular direction. Now, a couple things about attitude, a couple other thoughts. We're going to talk about this in a second. Yes, attitudes can change, but it's not easy. We tend to have an attitude ingrained in us at a very young age, and it's very difficult to move away from that. Not impossible, though. And the other thing is, a lot of times you might think, well, attitudes are a direct predictor of behavior. Not as much as you think. Okay, and we're going to talk about that in a second. There's a lot of times where people act differently than what they believe. Okay, and I'll give you some examples of that. All right, and so, you know, like I said here, just because a person has an attitude doesn't mean they're going to behave according to that attitude. Think of how many celebrities maybe have at one point given an anti-drug announcement or something along those lines, and later on they're busted for drug use or something, you know, like that. So that happens as well sometimes. Anyway, attitude formation, okay? Probably the most common way of explaining how attitudes are formed is through behaviorism, okay, which we've talked about before, especially last unit. Through conditioning and through modeling and things like that, kind of the environment that you're raised in, that has a big tendency to form your beliefs, your thoughts, your attitudes towards certain things. Okay, so children in particular, they tend to form the attitudes by imitating those around them. Whatever the parents are saying, the children tend to echo. Now, you can grow out of that. You can move away from your parents' beliefs as you get older. More often than not, you don't. You kind of fall at least in the same realm that your parents were in. Another explanation for attitude formation is what's called the mere exposure effect, and the idea is the more a person is subjected to a particular, a new stimulus, At first, it might not be pleasant, it might not be something you like, but the more you're around it, it tends to get better. Parents are often told with babies, okay, when you first start moving away from the bottle to actual food, baby food, they'll say you have to give a baby a particular food for a certain number of weeks. So the first time you give them the little jar of carrots or peas or green beans or whatever it is, they're probably not going to like it. It's the first time they're having it. Give it to them again, give it to them again, give it to again. They tend to start liking it as they're exposed to it. You could say the same thing, another good example, the first time you hear a song. Very few people hear a song for the very first time and it's their favorite song of all time. You hear a brand new song you've never heard before. Sometimes it can even be a little bit, maybe you don't, it's jarring, you don't even like it that much, but you hear it again, and you hear it again, and you hear it again, and pretty soon it's like, oh, that song's on, turn it up, because I like it, right? So the more we're exposed to it, the more we tend to like it. And lastly, we talked about how do we change attitudes. Like we said, it's not easy, but it is possible. So there's a couple different ways that you can go about moving someone from one attitude to another. The first one is called the peripheral route to persuasion. So the idea is you try to persuade someone to believe in a particular way with the use of outside factors. In other words, you're not directly trying to explain an idea or a belief or a thought or provide evidence for it. You're using outside factors to try to increase or influence the validity of it. So the best example, the easiest example, you're watching a commercial and all of a sudden you find out, the commercial features LeBron James. Now, at no point do they give any real kind of argument as to why the product he's using is better than any other product, but it's kind of like, well, if LeBron James uses it, then it must be good and it must be worthwhile. And so the nice thing about this is it can produce fast results. In other words, you're not really convincing somebody, you're not changing an idea that's within their soul. You're simply saying, hey, this guy used it, or this is the reason why you should use this, and because this person does, and so it tends to produce quicker results. Now, a longer but more effective strategy is the next one, which is the central route to persuasion. And that is where you lay out a very careful, very detailed explanation as to why you're right, as to why global warming is a thing, or as to why socialism doesn't work, or as to why discrimination is bad for the workforce, whatever else. So whatever the case may be, you are presenting a very clear cognitive argument as to why this is the case. Now this can take longer because you have to, again, it kind of goes along with the mere exposure effect. You have to expose people to these arguments over and over and over again, but eventually you convince them. Now if you've convinced them, it's probably going to be a permanent change. They're probably going to believe that way for the rest of their life, or at least for a long, long time, until somebody convinces them otherwise, which would also take a long time. Another strategy is what's called the foot in the door phenomenon. And the idea is you get people to first agree to a small, easy task, and then you eventually start upping the ante and asking them to do more difficult things. There's a great example of this during the Korean War. A number of American soldiers were captured by Chinese forces, and at first they were asked to do simple tasks, okay, something that any American wouldn't have a problem doing, and eventually they start asking them to do more and more difficult tasks, to the point where they got them to actually renounce America and everything America was doing, and praise the communist China and their system and everything else, and you kind of do it a step at a time. And so if you want to get someone, don't ask them to do a big thing at first, ask them to do a small thing, and eventually they're more willing to do bigger, more drastic things. And that's called the foot in the door phenomenon. You get that foot in the door and you kind of keep going. And then lastly, cognitive dissonance. This is what happens, this is the term or phrase which means that what you're doing does not line up with what you believe, okay? So you have a thought or you have an attitude about something, but for one reason or another, you are forced to do something, or you choose to do something different than what you believe. Now this is very disconcerting to us. It can create some mental anguish. We don't want it. So, but this can help explain why, for example, in times of war, people who are normally good people can do some pretty horrific things. Okay, and so what we find is that when this is the case, to ease this tension, because our attitudes and our actions are in conflict, to ease the tension, we are most likely to change our attitudes to line up with our actions than vice versa. In other words, we are going to justify why I can be horrible in this moment, okay? I can do horrible things to these people, they deserve it somehow, as opposed to changing the actions to line up with our attitudes. And so that's called cognitive dissonance, and the tendency is that our attitudes are much more likely to change than our actions are. We want them to align, but we go that way as opposed to the other way. So thank you if you watch this, and hopefully this helps you answer the quiz questions, and we'll see you back here tomorrow, probably with another video. Enjoy.